Welcome everybody, first of all, to my YouTube channel, Truth in Motion Studios, and to my conversation meeting, Katie Skurja. Katie is a family therapist, and she brings a fascinating mix of not just professional education, but also personal experience to the table. And I think you will find her very personable and very inspirational and just really helpful, because though she would not say probably that she was in a cult ever, she has experience very personally with deep with narcissistic people, and we'll hear much more about that from her. She has a master's in family therapy and also a master's in spiritual directing. So she is a fabulous mix of all these things that pertain to healing from spiritual abuse, and also an author of the book Paradox Lost: Finding Your True Identity in Christ. So I have the pleasure of asking her all the things. It's like when you meet a plumber, you ask them everything you need to know, or a lawyer. I get to ask the family therapist now all these burning questions I always had. And Katie, what I've heard from your upbringing, it sounds like both your parents were kind of on the narcissistic spectrum to varying degrees. And I would love to hear from you, looking back on your family story before the fire. Mm-hmm. What were the dynamics, if you look at it from not just your child's perspective, but also from a family therapist perspective, the dynamics of those two, growing up with those two parents, which I want to compare to growing up with people that are somewhat a little bit in a cult, their own little cult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the fire happened when I was 9 years old, and that precipitated, it was a year before then my parents went into a divorce. And looking back, I mean, at that time, there was only one understanding of a narcissistic personality disorder. Now in the most recent diagnostic manual, there's an understanding of the narcissist on the opposite end of the spectrum, and it has different names. One of them is the vulnerable narcissist, and it's like it's the one who comes from a one down narcissist versus a one up a narcissist, if that makes sense. My dad was in the classic narcissist of the one up, that center of the universe and kind of thing. My mom was very much on that vulnerable narcissist of so driven by what they saw to be right, that the rest of the world didn't make sense. I mean, didn't make sense in a sense, or they could justify everything that they were doing based on that. And so it was very polarizing, and you're trying to make sense of the world when you're a little kid, like mom, wanting to sneak out in the morning to go to mass all the time, and hiding from dad and don't tell dad, and that kind of thing. So it was confusing. I mean, it was a lot of which side are you on? And that continued for years. And even now, my siblings that are 50 years past the divorce, it's like they're still battling over who's right and who's wrong, kind of thing. And I've had to come to the place where I just believe that they each had their own form of crazy, I call it. We all have our own form of crazy. I mean, Carl Jung talked about how we all have to face our own madness. And I think that that's part of helping us to stay out of madness, is to recognize our own part in it.
And you were referring to the sides. Which side are you on? Which parents' side are you on?
Right. But that can play out, and it can play out between your parents. It could play out between your family and culture. It could play out between family and religious affiliation. It can play out in so many ways when it's sides. Which side are you on? And that goes to how we play out in drama, as we talked about. And I don't know if we want to jump into that right away, but it's whenever you're in a polarizing, good, bad, this is right, this is wrong, I mean, real stringent, then it's because you're stuck in some form of drama.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah.
and
So definitely, let's talk about drama. This will, I think, particularly speak to people who have been raised in cults. I
mhm,
was raised in baptism, which in Germany everybody thought I was in a cult, but it turned out it's way there's worse. And
right.
I don't think the Baptists are per se a cult. Um, but when your parents dictate the tone,
Mhm.
and you have this very clear understanding, this is us and everybody else is not us, it's them, and they are threatening, they're dangerous.
Right.
Talk to me
Right.
about
Well, I learned about the drama triangle when I was in my marriage and family therapy training. And it was articulated first by a man named Stephen Karpman in the 60s. And basically, if you picture an upside down triangle, and on the right upper corner is the rescuer. So it's a dynamic, it's a relational dynamic where there's three different roles. And there's a rescuer, and then a persecutor is opposite of it. And at the bottom point in this upside down triangle is the victim. And it's always presented that way because it pivots on the victim mentality, really. And it's driven by the victim mentality. There's an article that I use a lot by a woman named Lynn Forrest, and it's called Three Faces of a Victim, to describe it, because really even the rescuer and the persecutor are driven by a sense of being a victim.
that. Mm.
and and so I it made so much sense to me when I first learned this dynamic, and you could see it everywhere. But then at the same time, as I was beginning to learn this, I was in my spiritual formation training, and one of the classes was an Old Testament class. And we started from the beginning, and I could see it right there from the beginning. It's like Stephen Karpman articulated this thing, but it happened right there at the fall. You know, there was this right side up, what I've come to refer to now as a right side up triangle, where male and female are operating like side by side before God, and they're not ashamed of who they are and that kind of thing. And in Genesis 3, it's like that right side up triangle literally fell on its head.
Mm.
You know, like a literal fall almost, where even though I don't necessarily approach it scripture that way, you know, in that sense, but it's like this upside down, and where the serpent is acting like a rescuer, saying, I'll let you be like God. God won't let you be like God. God is the persecutor, I'm the rescuer, and you're the victim.
Mhm.
And there it comes into play. And it's like you're living from this, I call it the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is kind of embedded in that. And the tree of life is this other way of being.
Mm.
And so we live between these two triangles, and that dynamic is known the world over. I mean, and we can play it at all these different levels. I mean, we can play it within me, myself, and I, and we can play it with God, self, and others. We can play it with you know, within our understanding of God. I mean, it can play out at all different levels, but it always operates in this hierarchy.
Mhm.
So in it's like vying for, kind of like the dog eat dog way of the world and the animal kingdom, of this vying for position.
Yeah.
Whereas in what I would call a right side up triangle, or a tree of life, all of humanity is leveled. It's like the what I call the intrinsic authority that we have by being created in the image of God, that levels the playing field of humanity. And there's humanity and there's God, and we are not God. In a hierarchy, we are always vying for who's either closer to God, or if you're a full-blown narcissist, you are like equal with God. And that's where it gets really scary. But it's like hierarchy, and a dominance hierarchy always creates a flow downstream of the shame or of the pain, or who's downstream gets more of the blame and shame and pain,
Yeah.
just like what happened right there in the garden.
Yeah.
Nope, it's her fault, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, you said so many good things. Let's take that apart a little bit. The first of all, you were mentioning that the victim is in all of the figure in the corners of the triangle. There's the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim, but they all function from a victim mentality.
Yeah.
And an example that comes to mind is I never read the books, but in the movie The Hunger Games, the very last one, the second Mockingjay, when they finally have the control, and they're all the leaders or whoever they are sitting together in this circle, and they're talking about, so what are we going to do with snow, and what are we doing with the people that are responsible for our pain, for having oppressed us for so long. And there she is, I forget her name, but by
Katniss.
Katniss. Well, I mean the lady who was kind of the leader of the
Yeah. I don't remember her name.
Yeah, she just says, well, we'll do our own Hunger Games. And so she hasn't learned a thing. She has, that's that victim mentality.
Right.
I was persecuted, my parents were persecuted, and so forth, going back all these generations, we have suffered under the oppressors enough, and now they get the payback. When we're on top, we'll do the same thing to them to teach them. Yeah. And so that victim mentality, what have you seen? How can people get past that to not be part of the drama triangle?
Well, I think that the only way out of the drama triangle is understanding who, I mean, the way to live outside of it is to understand who you are in your imago Dei, which I refer to as the imago Dei, which is the Latin word for image of God. And I use this diamond as a kind of, I wish it was a diamond, but it's just,
I was going to say, is that real?
I know, right? But as a metaphor of the diamond that's inside of us, and that it's inside everybody. And when we, to the degree that we don't know this inside ourselves, then we are going to operate in some form of drama, and take one of those roles. So there's ways to get out, and that's facing our fears and facing the lies that we believe. And so that's the process out, but the way of living outside of it is through the imago Dei of, knowing like who I am. And it's like, I'm not going to let anybody define me, and I don't have to defend anything. So when you're going into defense of like, no, that's not who I am, you're already in drama, and you're giving the other person power, because you're defending by defending myself against a lie. I step into that dynamic.
Wow. Okay. So can you give me a practical example of someone stepping away from a victim mentality and into, I have intrinsic authority?
I could give so many. I'm trying to think whether I want to. When a parent is trying to help a child, for example, and you want them to learn to live from their imago Dei, but if we step into it by rescuing them, like, not letting them suffer their own consequences, much like the father in the story of the prodigal son, he lets the son go off until he comes to his senses. But if we operate as a parent in drama with our children, then we could operate as a rescuer, like bailing them out, again and again when they get into trouble. And then if we ultimately come to our senses and we realize this isn't helping them, and we stop bailing them out, they're going to see us now as a persecutor. And if you're a loving parent, you don't want to be seen as a persecutor. But in order to get, there's a tagline of the understanding drama, and so the way out of the drama is to be willing to be seen as the persecutor. So I'm willing to be seen as the bad guy helps me to get out. And your son is mad at you, and, well, I don't love you anymore, I'm never going to talk to you. It's like you're risking a break in relationship in order to let them be in their pig pen, so to speak, like in the story of the prodigal son, right? Because pain and suffering is oftentimes the way we learn. And when we rescue a child from their own pain and suffering, we're actually keeping them from learning.
Oh, yeah, that's so difficult.
It is.
Yeah, because if it's drugs or whatever the kids are into, it can feel like maybe you're even allowing them to get hurt very badly.
Oh, I mean, I'm talking from experience. I mean, my youngest son, we had to kick him out of the house when he was 18 years old in 2 weeks. It was 2 weeks past his 18th birthday.
Wow.
Because, and he ended up coming back in under a contract 2 weeks later because we said, we don't owe you anything. We don't, you can live here under, and it was related to some illegal activities such as that. And so we came up with a contract, and he was able to come back and live with us under that contract. But it's like, you're an adult. We don't have to let you live here now.
Yeah.
And so you can live here as a respectful side by side. You respect us, we'll respect you, kind of thing. And that happened a couple times until he ultimately left. But as a late 20s now, he would tell you that we did the right thing then. He was mad at us, and I risked him, not talking for a long time. And it was the hardest thing that we've ever done. But he said that was the right thing.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's very powerful.
My husband and I stood on the front porch and cried and held each other while our older son drove him off to go couch surf someplace. And we didn't know where he would end up, and we didn't know how long he would be gone. And we didn't know whether he would come back or not.
Wow. Yeah. Now, if we put that in a cult setting, let's say, there's so many ways this can play out, but let's look at it from the parents have a child that is in a cult.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody knows it except the child.
Mm-hmm.
And the parents are just so grateful for every little thing that the child turns to them for, but
Mm-hmm.
it ends up becoming, codependency, where you're actually starting to support the whole vehicle of the cult by giving money, for instance. And keeping the pain of the reality of the cult away from them because you're still rescuing them. Tell us more about that.
Well, unfortunately, there's not like an easy answer to every situation, right? It's like there is a time maybe when you do give money for various reasons, and there's a time when you don't. And so we want easy answers, but I think that when we operate from here, we have access to the wisdom of something greater than ourselves. And so we have to take each situation, even within a same, family. Like there may be a time where it's like, okay, this is what I am okay to do, and this is what I'm not okay to do. But am I free to say no is the question. I mean, if I feel compelled and I don't have the freedom to say no, then I'm not free to say yes, is what the saying is.
Right.
A guiding principle is, am I free to say yes? Am I free to say no, and am I free to say yes? If I'm not free on both ends of those, I can't make a clear decision about whether I should do this or not. Does that make sense?
Totally. And that's also a good indicator for, am I under a bad leadership or?
Absolutely. Like if I don't have the freedom to say no to something you ask of me, then I'm not really free to say yes. Then I'm under a compulsion of being a victim.
Yeah. That was, oh man, when my husband and I came to America, he is a Minnesotan, and we had just been kicked out of the group, and that's how our marriage started. We got married by them, and then got kicked out because they heard that we were rebellious in the way that we questioned some things and wanted to actually leave, but they kicked us out. And then once I read the book, The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, and things started to, my eyes started to open, and I started to consider myself a victim of abuse. My poor husband was he had been so much on the receiving end of abuse through me, because we had this long distance relationship just via the computer, writing emails, and then at some point Skype came into the picture, and so I abused him, I coerced him in so many ways. That was what came from the top, and I passed it on, and he was at the downstream, and he was like, who do you call a victim? How can you call yourself a victim? And that's what I tried to get through to him. I never had a choice. The choice was be obedient or go to hell.
And that, I'm glad you brought that up, Christina, because that's one good indication. It goes along with am I free to say yes or no? But when I believe I have no choice, I'm actually not free to make a choice. And in God, when I'm operating from that Imago Dei, that is not we always have a choice when we're there. That is not the way of life in the Imago Dei.
So he doesn't throw us to hell if we say, if we're not obedient?
That's not my theology.
But obviously it plays a big role in mental health, how we do view God.
Absolutely. What we view of God affects everything. And that's, what part of what I'm passionate about is helping people to understand that if your view of God is through the lens of drama, then it's going to lead you down a path of craziness. Because that is when I look at scripture where it says that Satan is the ruler of this world and it's meant to steal, kill, and destroy, that's what that is. I think that is the way of this world. It's not the way of God. And many people have, most of my work is done with people who would count themselves as a believer of one kind or another, and their view of God, a big part of how they're stuck is because their root view of God is through the lens of drama.
Yeah. And the drama is really gaslighting in a way, gaslighting theology. We call that good. He's
right.
good, but I have to obey or someone else goes to hell, and he will, what does it say in Ezekiel? Ask for the blood from our hands, from the people that we didn't preach to. That sounds like good news.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. The other piece that in the intro that you didn't talk about, I'm trained in marriage and family therapy and spiritual direction, but I'm also trained in inner healing, which is listening to, I boiled inner healing down to getting God's perspective. Like, how do I get out of drama and then bring this and get God's perspective about that? So I have the privilege of sitting in on, conversations where I'm, like, wow, watching people get transformed by what they sense God telling them. And in 20 years of doing this work, literally, I've never once sensed God viewing a person as a victim. Like, no matter what has happened to them, that's not how God sees us, because we are never a victim in this, right? It's like compassion all day long, empathy for what happened to us, but those things that happen to us never define us. And that's what keeps us stuck in drama, is when we will let either what happened to us or what other people think about us, those things end up defining us when we're not living from that Imago Dei. And when we're living from the Imago Dei, nothing defines us except for the identity that God said about us right there from the beginning in Genesis. Very good. That's it, that we are very good in that. And when we live from there, we have access to this transcendent power to not do the things that we hate.
Yeah.
Right. That we do when we live in drama, because all of us have been guilty of doing those things that we hate, overreacting, defending, blaming, all that stuff that happens in drama. And then if we can come to our senses, we go, we hate it. If we're still stuck in it, we just justify it and blame the other person.
Oh,
right?
What a lifelong way of changing your thoughts, or allowing who's inside of you to change you.
Right.
I still have I go to, I don't know, I bump my foot into something. It's like, who put that there?
Exactly. Yeah. It's an automatic reaction. It's so easy for us to land in that, and then we have to pull back and but a metaphor that I use for understanding these two ways of being, the upside down triangle, the drama versus what I would call life in God or in the Imago Dei. It's looking at kind of the difference between a septic tank system and a city sewer system.
Those are very personal topics to you, I know.
Right. Because I equate the shame as crap, and so we have to deal with our crap, right? But if you were to live, way out in the country and there wasn't city sewer, a septic tank is a good system. It's better than nothing, but it's a closed system, right? It's not recycling the crap. It's not cleaning. It's like, and it has to be cleaned out. And there's a need for a leach field, like something to get the overflow. And that's exactly what happens in drama. It's like somebody's going to take the crap. Somebody is going to get the downstream kind of stuff. And so we recycle it within the closed system, the pain and the shame, and it gets passed around like I call it a shame potato. We pass it around, and who's going to hold it? But when we connect with city sewer, you don't worry about what's going to happen there's no tank to worry about. There's nobody has to take the shame. God takes the pain and the shame and turns it into something good. He recycles our crap and turns it into compost that can grow something beautiful, right? Nobody has to take the pain and the shame anymore.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it works in a sense, but we have to pass our shame around in that system. And we don't have to do that when we connect to city sewer.
Yeah. So you are saying, you said that earlier about the other triangle, that in front of God, we are all on a level playing field. Tell me more about what you mean with the level playing field. You can feel free to bring authority up, your different ways of looking at authority.
Sure. I mean, basically that before God, we're all just children of God. So, I could put a child and a pope or a pastor or police or president or whatever, and before God, they're just two children of God. Like it becomes like, okay, you're a child of God. And that same diamond is in every one of them. So that levels the playing field. And so that when I talk about authority, the first and most important thing to understand about authority is that we all have it. We have it through the diamond, and I call that intrinsic authority. So that's the part that levels the playing field. On top of that, so it kind of, to pause there a second, it's like if you were to look at all of humanity with like spiritual goggles, and you could see there's a thread that connects every single one of us. Like we are connected, if by nothing else, just by that thing. Like every human that you see, you already have something in common because they have this intrinsic authority within them, which means they have value. They have something they could teach you. You could teach them. We all have something that we carry that intrinsic value. But that doesn't mean that my relationship with everybody is the same. So again, if you think of that thread that connects us, there's at least 4 other types of authority that I talk about, and there's probably more, but so far I've only seen it fall under these 3. Actually, in the talk that I did that you watched, I only talk about 3 other types of authority, but I've added a 4th one if I redid that talk. But there's position of authority, which is what can get people in trouble with a cult. Like if you don't understand your intrinsic authority, and then there's somebody that has a position of authority, we can put them automatically then up above us.
Yeah.
Right. There's a difference of if I keep them on the same plane because we have the same intrinsic authority, but now this thread between us, there's 2 threads. You have a position, and so there's something that you have that I don't have that allows. But I'm not going to allow your position of authority to trump my intrinsic authority. So whatever you say or do can't override what God says about me.
Yeah.
And I still have to keep that connection open. Okay. So there's one more thread between if somebody has a position. So a parent, a pastor, police, all of those things, they can abuse their authority. So I don't want to ever let them be above between me and God. There's relational authority. And that's when there's a openness between 2 people. So prior to, a week or so ago, we had no relational authority. We're building a relational authority. There's another thread between us, right? There's no position between us, but there's another thread that 2 weeks ago didn't exist. Okay. And that's this openness between 2 people, a mutual respect and a desire to connect and that kind of thing. So a parent could have a position of authority, but the relation authority is broken. Okay, so when we asked our son to leave, that relational authority was broken. We didn't have that with him. We still had a position, but we didn't have the relational authority. So another one is wisdom authority. And you could have somebody that is in your life that you give wisdom authority to, that you know they don't have a position and they don't have relationship. Like an author or a speaker or somebody, you may have never even met them, and yet they have wisdom authority in your life. So person could have position but not relational and not wisdom. Somebody could have a position and you don't trust their wisdom.
Yeah.
Right? That it's, we inherently, we put on all these things on a person just because they have a position, but that's not necessarily true. Right? They don't carry that. The one that I've added that I didn't put in that talk is competence authority, which I would distinguish from wisdom authority in the sense of like I had neck surgery 20 years ago, and I really want the person who's going to work on my neck to have competence, right? To competence authority. They don't need wisdom. I don't need a relationship. They have a transitional position in my life, but it's not really a position. I mean, and they have intrinsic authority. So you want somebody with a lot of competence that's going to do certain things, whether it's fixing your neck or fixing your plumbing. You know, you don't want the person who's going to cause a damage in your house, you know, because they don't have good competence in their area. But they don't need to have a position or wisdom or relational authority with that. If I don't see their intrinsic authority, I'm going to treat them as less than when they come into my house or into my relationship. But I can honor their, like, okay, you have this intrinsic authority, and but I don't need a relationship with the plumber, you know, unless they happen to be my son or uncle or something like that, you know. So some people, it's like that thread that connects. If you could see it in the spirit, there's like this grounded cord of a lot of threads that connects us. But those can get broken or they can be reestablished. But even if a person doesn't recognize my intrinsic authority, I can recognize theirs. You have value before God, and that's going to keep me from stepping into the drama triangle with them.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I don't recognize their intrinsic authority, it's almost like that chain or that connection between us. Now they can yank me in there instead of me bringing them into the presence of God and go, God, I know they're angry with me or they don't love me or whatever. How do you see them? And that helps me to stay grounded in what I would call the presence of God or the light or circle of love, whatever you want to call it. It keeps me from stepping into that other way of being.
Yeah. Do you have an example of what you were just describing about the intrinsic authority?
Well, I could tell you, for example, somebody who has all of those in my life, like I have a spiritual director who I've had the same spiritual director for about a dozen years or so. So I'm a spiritual director, and it's a way of walking alongside people. But I also have a spiritual director because I have my own crap that I have to continue to deal with, and my spiritual director has a spiritual director. So, but my spiritual director has all five of those authorities with me, right? He's got the intrinsic authority. He's got a position. He's had a position in my life for a long time. We have a good relationship. There's a mutual care and love and respect that is really obvious. He has wisdom authority in my life. He's one of my go-to people when I need to bounce something off. And he has competence, but he has competence in his area and certain areas, but I wouldn't go to him for competence authority of a plumber, right? So he has competence, but nobody has, if we give somebody competence authority because they have it in one area and then assume it in every area, again, I go back to, I'm going to give them too much authority and they're going to rule over me. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm kind of waiting for the if you have a experience you want to just share.
Well, I mean, so if I get stuck, I go to him. Yeah. You know, in a certain, if I need wisdom, he's one of my go-to people.
Yeah.
Now my spiritual director is getting up there in age, and I mourn the day when I have to find another spiritual director because we have to lay down those tracks now of relationship building and things like that. And he's walked along. It's going to be a very mournful thing for me to lose that. Makes me tear up just to think about it, because there's a lot of tracks there laid down. There are other people, and I trust that somebody else could come alongside and those tracks could be built up of that. When we, like I said, when we chose to, we didn't have to, when we chose to ask our son to move out because he wouldn't abide by the rules of the household, we knew we were risking breaking wisdom authority, relational authority, but we've been able to build that back up over time. And I will always have a position in his life. I biologically, I'm always going to be his mother. I can't not be his mother. But that position changes when he's an adult. I don't parent him anymore, right? I have to treat him like an adult. And our other son just got married last summer, and I told his then fiance, now wife, and I remind her, I'm not the number one woman in his life anymore. That's you, right? I had to switch out of the position. And if I try to hold on to that position, I'm abusing my authority, right? It's not my position anymore. That circle is closed around the two of you now, and I'm no longer in that circle. And at first she didn't understand that. She was like, well, you're always going to be the mother. It's like, oh, I'm always going to be the mother, but I don't have that position. You are number one woman, and I'm going to honor that as your position in his life.
Yeah, very good. Again, there was a lot there. So spiritual directing, I would love to know more. David Johnson is one of the authors of The Subtle Power of Spiritual Youth, and we sat down and he mentioned spiritual directing, that he has a spiritual director too. And that's if anyone wants to listen to that talk, it's the one, How to Hear God After Spiritual Abuse. We were pretty confident we could come up with something. No guarantees. But he was mentioning also spiritual directing. And for people that have been told, here is the word of the Lord to you, and because of the culture that many of us are being raised, and I'm referring to, well, it could happen in any Christian culture. It probably could happen to any religious culture, but particularly, that's my lens that I know, is the evangelical culture, where you have almost this victim mentality again. God speaks to other people. He only speaks to me through the Bible. And all I need is someone to tell me what to do. Or we might not initially think that, but then we're being told, don't expect God to talk to you until it sounds like what I'm telling you. Then it's God. That's how you know. Go ahead and share your thoughts on that.
Well, in some ways, I mean, I've long thought this. It's unfortunate that the name for spiritual direction is spiritual director. I mean, there's other names for it, like soul friend or soul companion. I mean, I'm part of a community called the Companioning Center, and we help train up spiritual directors. So it's an unfortunate title because it sounds like directing, like a one up, one down, but it's actually by its very nature, it's coming alongside someone to help them to connect with the divine. And, anybody could fall into operating out of drama, but by its nature, the very heart of spiritual direction is to do the opposite of what drama is. It's to come alongside. It's not to impose my view of God or my view of scripture or my view of anything. It's recognizing that there is something greater than ourselves. And, again, good spiritual direction training isn't going to keep in one narrow confines of what the divine is. A person can come from a Christian perspective, and yet the very training includes meeting the person where they are and what is the divine or what is the transcendent to that person. So if somebody is an atheist, they're probably not going to seek out a spiritual director. But I have spiritual directees who span the spectrum of where they are with God. And some people come in and they've been so wounded by God that they don't know where they want God, but they can't really, they don't know where they are. And so I'll use whatever language a person is comfortable with. I had one woman, she wasn't sure whether she believed in God or not, but she said, I do believe in a department of destiny. And so that's what we talked about was, what is the department? We actually did listening prayer with the Department of Destiny. And surprisingly, it sounded a lot like God. Right? Because what I say is that God doesn't have an identity crisis. Like, it doesn't matter what name you use.
Yeah.
God,
Yeah.
God loves you and wants to connect with you, and you are designed to be connecting with the divine. We are created to connect. I mean, that's this, they created in the image of God. We're created for relationship with that divine. And I just don't believe that God has an identity crisis and cares what we call God, you know. And so I've had Department of Destiny. I mean, she even said DOD, that was our shorthand for it, was the DOD. Yeah. I've used, you know, universe, circle of love. I mean, it's like, okay, what do we need to call to anything to get you? God's desire is to get you in a place of freedom.
Yes.
And there's no barriers to the name. And so back to spiritual direction, I mean, a good spiritual director, A, isn't trying to impose a theology, and B, is just always trying to direct you back towards the light. Who are you in the light? That's what it's about. It's an ancient practice that far predates counseling. And though it has some elements of counseling, and that's where my work kind of intersects the two. It has some elements that's like counseling in the sense of it's a professionally trained person walking alongside, but it's not problem focused in the sense of, counseling is problem focused. I have this issue and I want to work on this issue. Spiritual directions is a relationship that's ongoing as long as it's beneficial to continue to grow me into an awareness of God, and work to discern God's working in my life, and to discern pathways and things like that. So I've had 4 different spiritual directors over the years, some that, you know, either moved away or stopped working for a different reason. But one time it just didn't feel like this person was able to hold the things that I was bringing and really be strong enough to carry that. Whereas the person I'm with now, Jack, is just, it feels very able to meet me where I'm at and help me to discern things. And like I said, it's a sad thing to think about him not being around for a long time. You know, he's 78, so I don't know how long he'll be able to stay with me with that.
Yeah. What a gift, though. What a gift.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. My mother-in-law, I don't think has ever learned spiritual directing, but she's kind of that role for me too. I can bring anything to her, and it will not ruin her day. And she sure, if I ask her to, will tell me her angle, which is always a very special angle, just by the nature. She's a native. 50%. I'm getting this always confused. Her dad was either 50% or 100%, and Swede the other.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
combination.
Right. So she reminds me a little bit of you. Hair is not that different either. So it's just wonderful to have someone in your life. But her big point has always been, and that's making her intimidating, that she believes that God speaks to people and he speaks to her, but about herself. And if you want to hear what she thinks God is saying to you, to her, then that opens up this potential for this could be a bad relationship, which we have learned now over the years that it is so important when you want to give someone a word from God, when you believe you need to fill in the blanks, or when someone doesn't know the full picture, that you honor that they have their own intrinsic authority. And not only that you honor that, but that person knows it.
Right.
Because if they don't, then they fall right back into, oh, God is speaking to me. He's so nice to use this person to get to me.
Well, I mean, again, a good soul companion. So you're describing your mother-in-law as a soul companion. And I believe we are all called to be soul companions. We're not all professional soul companions, but I think we all are called to be that, to walk alongside and to, that there's a free flow between. That doesn't mean I have to take everything. You chew on the meat and spit out the bones, no matter who it is.
Yes.
Like as much as, say, Jack has that role in my life, I still don't want to put him up here. He has there's a lot of like I said, tracks between us, but I don't want to ever put him between me and God. That would be dishonoring to him and to me. But one of the things that you can do when you sense something that from God, and a way to honor the intrinsic authority in the other person is, would you like to hear my concerns? Or would you like to hear my perspective? And if the person says no, then you don't.
Yeah.
Because now you just put yourself like this.
Yes.
Right? So, I mean, even in my role when I'm operating with somebody professionally, well, they're coming because of that, but I still will say, what would you like to hear my thoughts about that, or my perspective, which I'm trying to distinguish between, let's see what God says about this. Okay, let's listen. So I can give my perspective. And in a professional role, I don't always say that, because they're there because they're wanting to come alongside. And yet I will still say that. But for example, with my son, I 100% of the time try to use that language with him. If I have a concern, if I have, if I want to give some advice, I will ask, would you like to hear my advice? Even when he's asking me something or I will turn it around and say, do you want to hear my perspective or my advice? And he'll say, yeah, that's what I'm asking. But if he hasn't asked, then I always like, do you want to hear it? And if he says no, then I don't. But because he knows that I'm not going to impose that on him, he almost never says no. And then I let it go and go, okay, what you do with that is your decision. It's not my life.
Yeah.
Right? But an abuse of an authority is, I told you this and now you should follow it. That's abusing their authority, because that's not honoring the person's choice in their intrinsic authority.
Oh, authority is such a difficult word and concept. What have you found works with people?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I have done studies on authority with hundreds of people, mostly believers, and found that it's such a sticky word, because we equate it with things like that are in drama, abusing authority. So, I mean, I've asked hundreds of people, what comes to your mind when you think of authority? And the words that usually come to mind are power, abuse, leaders, bosses. But a lot of times their hackles get up and they're like, I don't like authority. And if you don't like authority, you don't honor your own either, right? And so then I do this kind of a test with them. Okay, well, let's take this verse from scripture. All authority comes from God, submit to all authority.
Biggie.
And now, right, now let's take your words and put them in there and see if that fits. So boss, so all bosses come from God, submit to all bosses. Oh no. All power comes from God, submit to all power. No. And we go through every single one of the ones that they give me, and none of them work. And it's like, whoa, no, that doesn't feel true. So then we sit back. Well, what word can you come up with that you feel okay with putting in that phrase right there? All blank comes from God, submit to all of this. And the only word that we've been able to find over time is truth. All truth comes from God, submit to all truth. Okay. Now, for me, I would put an equal sign between truth and Christ, that if it's, and that goes back to the author. Authority is the word from author. The author of our faith is Christ. But if it's a non-believer, it's like truth. Can you submit to truth? Well, as a human being, we have to acknowledge that we're all in the process of trying to find truth. So when I give my advice to my son or anybody else, that's my truth, but it's not yours until you own it. And so I can't make you submit to it. And if I try to, I become abusive in my power, right? If I try to bend your knee to what I think is true, I'm not holding humility, and I start to abuse authority.
Yeah. So that brings us back to Christ within us, that small, still voice.
Exactly. If it doesn't resonate with you, there have been times where something that I have said, I come to realize, well, I was off base. Or there's been times where I realize I'm saying the truth, but they don't see it yet. And I can't make them see it. And so I have to sit back. They may come back around and see it. They may come back around and own it and not recognize that I had said that.
Yeah.
And I still have to let that go, right? It doesn't matter. It's just, it's, you have to live out your life before God. And, Christians who try to promote that you are just supposed to do what leader says, that's not true the way Christ lived, and that's not true with the apostles. If you look at that passage, and I can't quote the place in Acts right now, but I believe it's Peter and James standing before the Sanhedrin, and they're telling them, you have to stop speaking about this Jesus. And they say to him this amazing thing. They say, you have to do what you think is right before God, and we have to do what we think is right before God. Right? And they risk being thrown into jail, but we're not going to stop speaking about this freedom in Christ. Okay. So they didn't submit to those authorities.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it wasn't their truth. Right? The truth was what Christ was saying, and they weren't going to let this truth override that.
Yeah. Yeah. Could we agree that for people that don't want to make this spiritual, but want to believe in that same conscience, the same concept, that the word conscience could be interchangeable with inner truth?
Yeah, I mean, it's your conscience. I wouldn't put an equal sign between what I would call a big T truth and conscience. The greater consciousness, I would put an equal sign. But an individual conscience, you still have to honor your individual conscience. But for me, I wouldn't put an equal sign between your consciousness and what I would call a big T truth.
Yeah. Yeah, right? I totally get it.
Okay.
And I love that, because I think in back in the day in Germany, you actually have religion class in school. Right. Which is why I got into trouble here in America, because I studied religion and German to be a teacher for those subjects, but unless you go to a Christian school, you can't teach religion here. So I remember the teacher saying that conscience is the voice of God in our lives. And right. I feel like there's so much truth to it, but I would consider it now from life's experience and having seen a conscience being formed too, that it might be a window toward God or a door, and you definitely need to pay attention to it, but it is not the voice of Christ in your life.
I mean, I would say yes and no, in the sense of we all, if we don't approach that idea with humility of saying, yes, God is speaking through me and God is speaking through you. So let's take a big concept that we have to, something we have to discern together, and we aren't on the same page. And we have to humbly say, well, we're not on the same page. So I'm willing to be convinced that you're right, and you're willing to be convinced that I'm right. And we go through a process of discernment. And at the end of the day, we may still go, well, we don't agree, but I have to honor that in you and you honor that in me. Okay. Now, sometimes what we go through a discernment process and we are on the same page and we don't know why we came to that, but we have to live that out. Like, I'll give you an example. One that you and I talked about before was way back in 2004. It was in March of 2004, my then pastor was doing mission trips to Africa. And he kept telling me, Katie, one of these times you're going to go on this trip. And I said, okay, when God tells me, right? Because he had taught us to listen to the voice of God. And he had also taught us that how you discern, one of the primary ways you discern is when you're in unity with your spouse. Okay. So in this trip, he came to me and he said, this trip is for you. We're going to do a marriage retreat and you would be the right one because you just graduated marriage and family therapy. And I said, okay, well, I'll pray about it. And he was super excited, and he has this prophetic gift. And so he thought he'd heard the voice of God, and maybe he had, but God had to tell me for me to follow. I'm not going to follow what he says. I'm going to follow what God says. So my husband and I prayed about it and meditated on it individually and together. And neither one of us felt any sense of like we were supposed to do this. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have any reason why. We just didn't feel like we were supposed to do it. And I had, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, it was just flatline, 0. And so that was in the spring of 2004. They left about September 25th of 2004. And on September 29th, I got a call from the place where my mom was in a care center that my mom had suddenly died. And I was so, still brings tears to my eyes. I was so grateful that I hadn't listened to what my pastor said and done what he thought I should do and did what we felt like God was leading us to do. Okay. I was so glad that I was here with my siblings and I was able to walk that out. And there was just some really precious times in there. And later on, I taught that story, and this woman came up to me and she said, "You should never tell that story," because I was teaching about authority. "You should never share that story again, because people should do what their pastors say and let the dead bury their own dead."
Ooh, owie.
I know. And I just thanked her, and she said, "I like what you're teaching, but you should never teach that." Well, you don't understand what I'm teaching then, right? And in my mind, I said, I'm going to teach that story all the more, because no, that's not the way we're not called to follow a pastor. We're called to follow one God, and that's it. Yeah. And I even went back to my pastor after that, and I asked him, I said, "Do you think I made a wrong choice?" And he said, "No, you made the right choice." He said, "No, that was the right." He goes, "I don't understand it, because I felt this strongly." And he prides himself on his prophetic gift. And yet I admire him that he was able to, he held me like this, side by side. "No, you made the right choice." He goes, "I think other people sometimes have missed a calling and an opportunity, but that was right for you."
Yeah. So good. In my college experience, if I did what the leaders would tell me to do, quite literally, it would get me into trouble again and again. And then the question would be, they would take me aside and say, "So, Christina, what's going on?" And then I would say, "Well, I did what you told me to do." But then have a bad outcome would always be on me.
Yeah.
Something I did was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
So God couldn't bless it, or I messed it up myself, or hidden sin.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of that poor woman who took you aside to give you her unsolicited concern.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's probably the kind of system that she calls home.
Oh, absolutely. Because we understand God so much through this drama, and whoever's ahead of you, then that's who you're supposed to listen to. We don't understand that we have direct access to God, and that's our conscience. And we learn that through community of listening to each other, people that we trust. But people who aren't free enough to let both questions be possible aren't able to discern with us. Yeah. So in a sense, my pastor at that time wasn't a good person to help discern, because he was absolutely concerned at that time I was supposed to go. Mm-hmm. He couldn't see any reason why I shouldn't go. Right.
Yeah, and he had the vision, the project in mind.
Right.
In line, God is doing something here. Don't stand in the way.
Yeah. 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 So I mean, if we stand in our Imago Dei, we can take information from anybody. Mm-hmm. And then I don't have to be afraid I can listen to whatever you have to say, and I can hold it before God. And sometimes it just like, it blows away like, dust in a windy day. It's like, it doesn't hold any weight. But if I bring it in and it's something I hadn't considered, I'm like, okay, well, it doesn't, I can hold this. Now I can also pray about it and listen to other people that I trust. And if it seems to keep lining up and coming back to this, then it's like, oh, okay, I might make the choice to do that. Now it's on me whether it works or not, because I'm making the choice. If I had listened to to my pastor and had gone to Africa and then found out my mom died, and I hadn't felt it from, I could have easily blamed him. Right now, it's his fault that I'm in Africa and I'm not there. Right?
Ah, so good, so good. And then it's again the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. And your husband has to step in and say, "You bad pastor," and you
Right,
say,
right. Yeah. And I couldn't blame, if I felt, we could put it within a spousal relationship too, because sometimes women, not sometimes, often too often, women are taught, well, you don't have to discern your own conscience. You listen to what your husband says.
Yes.
So if he felt yes and I felt no, and so then I listened to him, now I have him to blame.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? But if we both felt it really strongly, like 100%, and the finances came through, and it was this great conference and people were getting free, and then my mom died when I was in Africa, who do I have to blame? I can go, okay, God, maybe this is a time where the dead bury their own dead and I don't get to be there. But that wasn't the situation. And like I said, I will forever be grateful that I was there with my siblings and to celebrate my mom and her death. And it is, I feel a very tenderness from God protecting me from that.
Yeah.
It was a really sweet and precious time to be here with that.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that I wasn't in Africa when that happened. And it was unexpected. We didn't see it coming. I had just seen her the week before.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, she was in a care center, so it wasn't completely unexpected.
Right.
But there was, I mean, she could have lived another 5 years or something. I mean, she died standing up singing My Wild Irish Rose. The care person was helping her to get dressed, and she was singing, and that was just her heart. And then her heart just stopped and she fell down, and that was the end of it. And yeah.
Wow.
So that song still always has a special place in my heart.
Yeah. I understand that. Yeah. Wow. I so appreciate about what you're bringing, that there's not ever a yes to your question or no to it. It is always this spectrum.
Yep.
And I can tell that you're walking it out. You have a high view of people. You honor, you respect, you empower, you want to see people act in their own, well, you would say imago Dei, in their own image of God within themselves.
Their own authority.
Own authority, own truth.
Right.
And often what the way you think, it sounds paradoxical.
It's very paradoxical.
Hence the paradox lost, and you're probably teaching us that the paradox needs to enter back our way of thinking. Mm-hmm. Would you tell me more about that, especially in light of cultish thinking, where there's only A and B and nothing else?
Right. Well, I mean, there's a lot of things we could talk about with these two triangles of what distinguishes them. Yeah. One of them, big distinguishing factors between these two, is that drama functioning not only is it always operate hierarchically, but it operates in black and white ways. There's A or B. It's good or bad. It's this or that. It's in or out. It's very what's called a zero sum. Somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. Mm-hmm. That's it. Mm-hmm. A distinguishing factor of life in the circle of love, or light, on the right side up triangle, is that it's a win-win. That we're always seeking, how do you win and I win, and it's not characterized by a dominance hierarchy, even when you're in a position of authority. Mm-hmm. And again, Jesus modeled this. He had the ultimate position of authority, and he didn't lord it over. Mm-hmm. Right? He doesn't hold his power over. He let people walk away. He let people choose. Mm-hmm. So it's, and it can embrace nuance. It's like, okay, well, this is my truth and that's your truth, and the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. If we are both trying to seek truth together. And so we keep, working towards the what's going to bring us into a win-win. And even if there's something that we disagree on, we don't let that thing we disagree on override the fact that you still have value and you are still my brother and sister through this thing that connects us. And so that's part of the nuance, is like, we can disagree, but we're going to stand in this inner circle where we value each other no matter what we believe about this or that, even if we can't agree on it. Like, if you let that intrinsic authority be the thing that you stand on, that's the hill that you die on. We could talk about all of these other things and they don't have to change the fact that we can treat each other with respect. I think that's the concept that could change the world if we could get a hold of that. But because we live so much in this place of drama, that's the first thing we override, is the intrinsic authority.
Yeah.
If we turn that upside down and we make that the basis of our relationships with people, we would change. We would impact the world in a big way.
Yeah. Yeah. Truth that sets you free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have not talked about the Swedish connection yet, and I do want to honor your time and bring it to a close. But I was going to introduce you as not 7 of 9, but 7 of 11, because you have children. And I know I have a few people.
Right. I don't know if you said, I have 10 siblings.
Yes. So 11 kids, and you were the 7. That's your specification, 7 of 11. And the nerds that like to watch Star Trek, and also I know of a couple that come to mind that would watch this too. They would love if I mention the whole Borg sounds Swedish, so we give them the nod. So Sweden, you have this beautiful talk on YouTube where you talk about the Swedish connection, and maybe we can end on that note, because when I heard you talk about that, I realized this is why you realize there's no healing for you, at least. I don't want to make it too broad of a statement, but for you, there was no healing but heaven touching you and sparking that inner diamond of you. Do you want to share a little bit of that?
Yeah, I do. I'm not Swedish, a very small amount. I did my DNA, and I'm very small amount by DNA, but I have a strong connection to Sweden because when I was 16, I was an exchange student there for a year. And it really was a hugely transformative year for me. And that has, 40 some years later, still impacting me, partly because that it just had the ripple effect that kept going, but also because one of my host sisters ended up marrying my brother. Yeah. And so I have, our families are intertwined now. I mean, my nephews are my Swedish parents' grandchildren, and I've been back several times and that kind of thing. But my first encounter, where it was my encounter with God, happened there. And it wasn't because somebody had me say any magic words or anything like that. It was just, I experienced this place of freedom where I had this moment where I knew that there was a God, and that God loved me. I just had like something in that space of freedom from the chaos of my upbringing, being in this place of beauty and order that just touched my imago Dei and set me on this path of discovering who is this God that just, I felt connected to everything in that moment. And it was just an encounter. I don't know what else to call it. It wasn't like I said, nobody led me through, becoming a believer or anything like that. I was raised in the church, but like many people, where you have, of God, but you don't know of God, and I always come here because that's where I feel that place where I'm connected is here. And that it's a place where I knew, like, everybody that I saw, I was connected to. I was just like, and it's that thread that you see, it's like everybody you meet, there's not somebody you're not connected to through the Spirit, through that imago Dei. And I didn't understand that term back then. It's been growing into that, and I like that term just because it's kind of because it's Latin. It's not religious based or anything like that. It's just, and unfortunately, it's a concept that many churches overlook. It's like the primary thing that we need to teach, and we don't even talk about it. We talk about who's in and who's out. And we talk about it as if we get that in somebody when they make the right profession of faith or something like that. It's not, you don't get it in there. It already is in there. How do you help them see it?
Yes. Just get the stuff out of the way. Help
Yeah.
them recover.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if that's what you were thinking in terms of the Swedish connection, or there was a part of that.
Yeah.
But,
When you talk about it in that talk, you said, I think at some point, like the clarity, and you just said it too, you had so much chaos in your life, and then the freedom and in the order that you experienced in Sweden, there just came a clarity over you that has put you on a path.
Because going back to the paradox, if you come from a place of great chaos, and then you experience order, chaos and order are a paradox that are held together in the cosmos, in the, in Christ. And so it was a balancing to bring that kind of a yin and a yang. And so if you come from real rigidity and you experience some of the creative chaos, you might have that opposite. You coming from an opposite way, but you still come to that place. And the mistake that we can make is if we throw out whatever we're coming from in order to embrace the opposite, because that's still going to be in the black and white of drama. Right. And so, and for a while I did do that. I was guilty of that. I kind of threw out, held my family less than, and my culture less than, and my even my religious upbringing as less than. And as I was able to come and hold both of those, I can find the beauty and the shadow in each one of those. And that's that place of nuance, is that we can find the good and realize that there's a shadow side to everything. I mean, there's a shadow side to every culture. There's a shadow side to every person, every trait, that only when they're held together in the light does that override the shadows. And that's when we hold the nuance together. And I can end with a story about that. A young woman, she's in her probably early 30s or just about 30 when she came to me, and she had come out of a really, really, really rigid homeschool community where it was like almost their family was the only truth, so there was a little bit of a, if you were a homeschool family that kind of believed with them, you almost would be accepted, but it was like just their family was the truth, right? Which is a really small, rigid chaos, the opposite of chaos. And it was very hard for her to be seen as the persecutor, to walk away from that, to think something different from her family. And part of her healing was coming to accept that fact that they may never accept that, and that she had to be who she was and learn how to love them anyway in light of that. And this one day I get this text from her out of the blue, and she'd actually had made a donation to the ministry that was out of the blue. And I texted her, I said, what was this about? And she goes, well, I'm driving home to see the family. I'm driving a car that I would have never driven. My hair is longer or shorter than it ever would have been, because she had to have it long. I feel more in love with Jesus than I ever have. And I just said shit when I missed my exit. That's why. So she was not doing the things that her family said that she had to, and she was okay with it, and she was still loving them. She was still going home to be with them, to visit them, but she also could say no when they wanted her to come and she didn't feel like it or wasn't able to. And so she had this freedom to love herself, love God, and love them, and yet do her own thing. And she wasn't living within those rigid confines of what they said you had to do. And, she's like, she would have never said shit. She would have never been driving this car. She would have never had short hair, listening to music that was off base, not acceptable. And she was finding God in everything.
Wow.
Right. And she had had a much bigger God. We blow up those boxes and go, God is so much bigger than those little rigid confines that we put him in.
Yeah. Beautiful. How hopeful.
Yeah, it was such a great text. I saved that text because it was like, oh my gosh, it was the best. And that's why I do the work that I do is because of things like that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I will try to finish now. I would love to keep going, but yes, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, letting us into your lens, into your way of thinking. I think that's very powerful and inspirational to people, and empowering. More importantly, it's empowering, which is wonderful. You point away from yourself and want to see people empowered. Thank you so much for that.
That's the key to getting out, is to be empowered and find your own voice and your own authority.
Yeah.
So really great to have a conversation with you, Christina.
Thank you so much.